May 1943, the North Atlantic. For 3 years, Admiral Dönitz's U-boats had ruled these waters, but one order from Berlin, a single line of radio code, changed everything. It wasn't the Allies that broke the U-boats. It was Germany itself. Before we begin the story of strategy, arrogance, and silence beneath the waves, take a moment to like this video and subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy exploring the forgotten side of World War II. Tell us in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is there. It's always fascinating to see this global crew of history lovers. Now let us dive beneath the Atlantic. Chapter 1. The Wolfpack's Glory Autumn, 1942. The North Atlantic was a graveyard of steel. Convoys burned from horizon to horizon. Ships cracked apart in the freezing swells. And on the radio, one name echoed through the storm. Dönitz. Admiral Karl Dönitz, commander of the German U-boat fleet, the man the Allies called the Sea Wolf. To Berlin, he was a strategist. To London, he was a ghost. To the sailors crossing from America to Britain, he was death beneath the waves. For a brief moment, he had achieved the impossible. Germany, without a surface navy, was starving an island empire. In the perfect machine, Dönitz believed in precision, not brute force. He built his navy from the silence of the deep. The U-boats were his wolves, and he hunted in packs. They called it Rudel Taktik, the wolfpack tactic. A single submarine would spot a convoy, shadow it for hours, and send a coded signal back to base. Convoy sighted. Within hours, up to 20 submarines would converge on the same coordinates, sliding through black water like knives in the dark. When the signal came, attack tonight, 2,300 hours, the North Atlantic became a slaughterhouse. Torpedoes streaked through the waves. Oil tanks erupted. Men leapt into burning seas as the wolves circled again. One U-boat commander wrote in his log, "Through the periscope, I see fire on the horizon. The sea is red. I feel nothing." It was efficiency, not hatred, that made them deadly. By 1942, Dönitz's submarines were sinking Allied ships faster than the British could build them. Each month, hundreds of thousands of tons of cargo fuel, wheat, weapons vanished beneath the waves. In Whitehall, Churchill whispered to his staff, "The only thing that ever truly frightened me was the U-boat peril, in the code of the sea wolves." But what made Dönitz's fleet so effective wasn't just the submarines. It was order radio discipline so strict it bordered on religion. Every boat, every patrol, every engagement began with a single coded message from Berlin. At 0600 and 1800 each day, U-boat commanders tuned their radios to receive instructions from Befehlsstelle Atlantic, the command center for the Atlantic. Encrypted through the Enigma system, these orders told them where to hunt, when to strike, and, most importantly, when to remain silent. The system worked like a symphony of death. Hundreds of submarines, coordinated across thousands of miles, moving as one. And for nearly 3 years, it worked flawlessly, counting just the illusion of control. But the more success Dönitz had, the more control Berlin wanted. Hitler began to see the U-boats not just as a weapon, but as a symbol of German genius, proof that even without battleships or carriers, the Reich could dominate the sea. Orders grew longer. Tactics became dictated not by captains beneath the waves, but by bureaucrats above them. Still, the results spoke for themselves. In March 1943 alone, U-boats sank 108 Allied ships, the peak of the Atlantic campaign. Even Churchill admitted defeat seemed near. But behind that triumph, a small, invisible mistake had already begun to unravel everything. One that would start with a single transmission from Berlin and end with the destruction of the U-boat fleet itself. Chapter 2. The Code That Ruled the Sea. Kerkrade, the Netherlands, January 1943. Beneath a concrete bunker carved into the soil of occupied Europe, the heartbeat of the German U-boat war pulsed through static and code. This was Befehlsstelle Atlantic, the nerve center of Admiral Karl Dönitz's silent empire. From here, orders were sent through the Enigma cipher, 3 rotors, 26 letters. A machine so complex, the Germans believed it unbreakable. Each message traveled from Berlin to Paris, from Paris to Lorient, and then to the submarines stalking the Black Atlantic. And it was here, on a cold morning in January, that one order, simple, logical, and fatal, was written, in the order of obedience. The message began with 6 digits and 1 word, Alleinangriff verboten, independent attack forbidden. From now on, no U-boat would strike alone. Every assault must be coordinated, every convoy engagement approved by command. The intent was tactical discipline. The result was catastrophe, because what Dönitz didn't know, what no one in that bunker could imagine, was that every single one of those encrypted messages was already being read in London. The invisible listener. For months, the Allies had been breaking Enigma faster than Berlin could change its settings. Inside Bletchley Park, British mathematicians, Polish cryptanalysts, and a young man named Alan Turing were reading Dönitz's orders almost in real time. When the group attack-only order was transmitted, Bletchley intercepted it, decrypted it, and passed it directly to the Royal Navy's Western Approaches Command. Suddenly, the Allied convoys knew where the wolves would gather and set their own traps accordingly. The order that was meant to unify the pack instead exposed it. The wolfpack becomes prey. In early March 1943, U-boat group Raubgraf, Robber Baron, received its first new-style directive. 30 submarines were to converge on convoy SC-122 midway between Greenland and Ireland. They followed the code to the letter, but the convoy had already been rerouted by Allied intelligence. When the submarines arrived, they found not merchant ships, but destroyers. Within hours, 3 U-boats were gone. Another 5 damaged beyond repair. Berlin blamed bad weather and radio interference. But the pattern kept repeating, and every time, the Allies were waiting. The men who knew nothing down below, in the iron bellies of the U-boats, crews trusted the code. They didn't question orders. They didn't know that their messages, encrypted, proud, flawless, were betraying them. A radio operator aboard U-404 wrote in his diary, "We receive orders every morning. The British must be blind. They find us again and again. Perhaps the ocean itself has turned against us." Another commander, Captain Lieutenant Top, complained that Berlin's new coordination orders forced him to stay in position for days, long enough for Allied aircraft to find and kill him. Still, Dönitz refused to change course. He trusted the system, and the system was lying to him. The invisible collapse. By April 1943, Allied radar, sonar, and code-breaking had turned the North Atlantic into a trap. Every radio signal became a beacon, every order from Berlin a death sentence. But Dönitz remained convinced of his control. His pride and his faith in order would soon cost him the one thing Germany couldn't replace: its submarine crews. The Battle of the Atlantic had reached its turning point, and Berlin didn't even know it had already lost. Chapter 3. The Fatal Order. April 28, 1943. Berlin. In the gray morning light, Admiral Karl Dönitz entered the Reich Chancellery, carrying a folder stamped Geheime Kommandosache Top Secret. Inside were reports from the Atlantic. Dozens of U-boats missing, hundreds of sailors dead, convoys barely scratched. Hitler was waiting. His patience was gone. "You told me the Atlantic would be ours," he shouted. "Britain should be starving by now, and instead, they re-landing tanks in Africa." Dönitz, exhausted and loyal, bowed slightly. "Mein Führer, it will be ours again." I only need authority to use everything. That morning, Hitler gave him full control over the German Navy, and Dönitz left the Chancellery with the power to make one last, decisive gamble. He would rebuild the wolfpacks, he would restore the offensive, and he would do it by the book. What followed was the order that destroyed his fleet. The order from Berlin. On May 3, 1943, from the Dönitz command bunker in Paris, a coded message went out to every U-boat in the Atlantic. All available boats are to regroup for coordinated attack. No independent action. Maintain radio contact. Execute Operation Donnerkeil. It was supposed to be the great counterstrike, a storm of submarines unleashed across the Atlantic. Instead, it was suicide. Because with each radio transmission, the Allies were listening. The trap is set. At Bletchley Park, a British Wren operator tapped her pencil against the decoding log. Berlin has ordered group coordination, she said. Her commanding officer nodded slowly. Then we know exactly where they'll be. Within hours, every Allied convoy between Newfoundland and Liverpool was rerouted through new, guarded corridors. Patrol planes lifted off from Iceland. Destroyers armed with new HFDF, Huff Duff, radio tracking gear waited in the fog. When the wolfpacks rose to transmit, they were no longer hunters, they were targets. The black. The first losses came on May 5th, then May 6th, then May 8th, when U-125, U-438, and U-531 were all sunk within 12 hours of each other. By May 15th, the Atlantic was a graveyard. 41 U-boats gone in a single month, the worst in German naval history. Crews were dying faster than they could be trained. Each new radio order from Berlin brought more silence in reply. Some captains stopped reporting altogether, preferring to vanish without orders rather than obey them. In the bunker, Dönitz stared at the loss chart, red X's covering the map from Greenland to the Azores. He whispered to his adjutant, "We are no longer at war with England. We are at war with the sea itself." Collapse of the Wolfpack. By the end of May, the once dominant U-boat arm was broken. The Atlantic crossing, once a nightmare for Britain, was now safer than it had been in years. Dönitz, still clinging to obedience, sent one final order. Withdraw from the North Atlantic, regroup, and await new directives. It was the closest thing Germany ever came to surrendering a front without admitting it. In 7 days, the ocean that had once been Hitler's last weapon had turned against him completely. A fleet, betrayed later that year, Allied intelligence would call it simply Black May. The Germans never officially acknowledged what caused it. But the truth was clear. The Enigma didn't fail. The sailors didn't fail. Berlin failed them. By demanding control of every movement, by centralizing every decision, Hitler and Dönitz had turned precision into predictability, and the sea devoured them for it. Chapter 4. The Men Who Knew They Were Doomed. North Atlantic, May 1943. The sea was flat that night, too flat. No wind, no moonlight, only the hum of the diesels echoing through steel. Inside U-305, 20 men moved in silence, breathing recycled air that smelled of oil, sweat, and fear. They were part of Wolfpack Donnerkeil, the last great offensive of Dönitz's fleet. But already, they knew something was wrong. Every time they rose to periscope depth, they found nothing, or worse, found themselves hunted. The radio operator, Oberfunkmat Franz Müller, kept a small notebook beside his station. On May 10th, he wrote one line. "We are supposed to be the predators, but the ocean feels like it's watching us." The silence of the deep. At 21:17, a coded message came from Berlin, short, routine, confident. "Proceed to grid AM 356, await further instruction." The commander, Kapitänleutnant Heinrich Schlosser, didn't he even look up from his map. He knew that await meant transmit, and transmit meant die. He folded the paper, tucked it in his jacket, and said quietly, No transmission tonight. We move east. The men didn't argue. By now, disobedience wasn't mutiny. It was survival. For the last cigarette. 2 decks below, machinist Hans Weber sat on an ammunition crate, smoking his last cigarette. He had written a letter to his wife, Greta, in Hamburg. He knew it would never reach her, but he wrote anyway for the rhythm of it. The air here is thick. The engines shake like old men. I can hear the sea scrape against the hull at night. Sometimes I think I hear voices in the pipes, maybe the ones we sank. He folded the note and hid it behind a panel near the torpedo room. No one would find it until decades later, when divers explored the wreck resting 3,000 meters below. The sound of death. At 02:12 a.m., the sonar operator heard it a low pulse in the distance, then 2 short pings. Destroyers. The commander whispered, "Crash dive." The U-boat sank into the darkness, descending past 50, 70, 90 meters. The lights flickered. Somewhere, a bulkhead groaned like a dying animal. Then came the depth charges. The first explosion knocked out the lights. The second tore open a ballast tank. The third silenced everything. U-305 was gone, one of 41 that vanished that month. Letters never sent. Across the fleet, the stories were the same. Men wrote final letters, spoke into recorders meant for morale broadcasts, and prayed in the dark. A captured diary from U-230 read, "We receive orders from Berlin. They must know we are being slaughtered. Still, they tell us stay, attack, position. I no longer believe they can hear us at all." When Allied ships pulled survivors from the water, most were silent. One officer, when asked what had gone wrong, simply said, "We obeyed too long." For the end of the wolves. By June 1943, Dönitz S., once proud Unterseebootwaffe, was a shadow of itself. Crews were now teenagers, barely trained, barely armed, sent to sea in submarines that might never surface again. The men who survived the Atlantic spoke of it not as war, but as punishment. "We stopped fighting the British," said one survivor years later. "We fought the ocean, and Berlin was on the ocean-s side." Chapter 5. The Day Berlin Went. Silent, May 23, 1943. Paris, Naval Command. The room smelled of dust, tobacco, and exhaustion. Teletypes clicked like distant gunfire, printing fragments of a war that had already been lost, but no one dared say it. At 09:41, a coded message from Berlin arrived, the last one anyone would ever receive that month. It was short, almost polite. All boats to hold position. Await further orders. The operators copied it onto red-bordered paper, signed the logbook, and waited for the follow-up transmission that never came. Berlin had gone silent. The silence that killed for hours. Radio officers across the Atlantic waited for updates. No weather data, no convoy routes, no confirmation of survivors. Inside U-753, Lieutenant Werner Beck sat staring at the receiver light, its steady green glow mocking him. He had lost 2 men the previous night to a near miss from a depth charge. The pressure gauge trembled with each new vibration. "If they're not answering," he whispered, "it means they don't have anyone left to answer." By then, most U-boats were already running silent, not by command, but by fear. Berlin's control, once absolute, had vanished into static. A fleet without a commander in Paris, Dönitz's staff began burning documents. Order logs, cipher sheets, location grids all fed to the furnace. The Admiral himself stood before the wall-sized map of the Atlantic, marked with hundreds of pins, each representing a U-boat, each now nothing more than a guess. "We've lost the ocean," he said quietly, "and with it, the war." When his adjutant asked if they should issue a retreat order, Dönitz shook his head. There's no one left to retreat. The next day, the British began broadcasting open-frequency messages. To all German submarines, cease operations, surface, and surrender. Some obeyed. Most never heard the call. The ones who returned. In early June, the first crippled U-boats limped into the French coast. U-333 arrived with only half her crew alive, her conning tower scarred black, her captain barely conscious. A dockhand remembered the scene. They stepped onto the pier like ghosts. No salute, no words, just silence. For the surviving sailors, the realization came slowly that the war they had fought with such precision had ended not with a battle, but with a broken radio link, the sound of nothing. By midsummer, the Atlantic was quiet again. No pings, no propellers, no wolfpacks, only wrecks below and rumors above. At Bletchley Park, an analyst noticed something eerie. For the first time since 1940, she said, the Enigma boards are blank. The war would drag on for 2 more years, but the Battle of the Atlantic, the struggle that once decided the fate of Britain itself, was over. And all it took was one fatal habit, an army that obeyed too well. Darpatum. Epilogue. The legacy beneath the waves. Today, divers still find the skeletons of those iron wolves scattered across the Atlantic seabed, rusted, silent, still on patrol. When sonar pings echo through the deep, some submariners say they can almost hear the Morse rhythm of old messages, tapping through the static of history, awaiting orders. But none ever came. As the echoes of the Atlantic faded, Germany's Iron Fleet slipped beneath the waves, not defeated by force, but by faith in orders that no longer led anywhere. From Berlin's silent transmitters to the cold graves under the sea, the story of the U-boats was more than a battle. It was a warning. A warning about what happens when obedience outlives reason. History remembers the victors, but it is the ones who never came home who remind us what blind loyalty costs. Stay healthy, stay curious, and remember every untold story you share here keeps another voice alive beneath the silence of history.